Welcome to INN's Student. INN Student is a platform for law students to come here and deliver a lecture on the topic of their choice. Today we have with us law student Tashu Gaikwad. She is going to speak on Directive Principles of State Policy, an idea of welfare state. She is from KES Shri Jayanatilal H Patel College of Law. So without wasting further time, I would request her to commence with the lecture. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I am Tashu Vinayak Gaikwad, a 4th year law student from KES Shri Jayanatilal H Patel Law College. Today I am going to talk on the directive principle of state policy and the idea of welfare state in India. If fundamental rights tell us what we can demand from the state, the directive principle tells the state what it must deliver. If the Constitution of India is often described as a living document, it is not only established governance of but also lays down the vision for the kind of society India aspires to become. One of the most profound expressions of this vision is found in the directive principle of state policy, which embodied in the idea of India as a welfare state. When India attained the independence, the nation was burdened with poverty, illiteracy, unemployment, social discrimination and economic inequalities. The framers of Constitution were aware that merely guaranteeing political freedom would not be sufficient. True independence required social and economic emancipation. It is in this context the directive principle of state policy were incorporated into the Indian Constitution. Now we'll see what is the concept of welfare state and the role of directive principle of state policy in India. A welfare state is one in which state actively ensures social and economical well-being of its citizens. It goes beyond maintaining law and order to promote social justice, economic equality and human dignity, aiming to create conditions where every individual can live a life with dignity regardless of their background. In such a state, welfare measures like education, healthcare, employment, and social security are treated not as a charity but as a constitutional obligation, recognizing that unchecked inequalities between democracy and the state regulates economic activities to prevent exploitation and ensures fair distribution of resources, unlike a laissez-faire state, where minimal intervention often leads to widening disparities and marginalization. In India, the concept of welfare state is rooted in the preamble, which promises social justice, economic justice, and political justice, along with the liberty, equality, and fraternity. Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar stressed that political democracy cannot survive without the social and economic democracy, viewing democracy as a way of life grounded in these values. The directive principle of state policy, contained in Part 4 of Indian Constitution, provides the constitutional framework for realizing this vision. They guide the state in framing welfare-oriented framework for realizing this vision. They guide the state in framing welfare-oriented laws and policies to reduce inequalities, protect workers and weaker sections, promote education and public health, and ensure the dignified standard of living. Though they are non-justiciable, they are fundamental in the governance, transforming the idea of welfare state into practical and continuous obligation of the state. Now we'll see the background and constitutional origin of the DPSPs. To fully understand the importance of directive principle of state policy, it is necessary to examine their historical and constitutional background. The concept did not develop from isolation, but it was influenced by the constitutional practices in the other democratic nations. The immediate source of directive principle is the Irish Constitution, particularly from Article 45, which laid down social policy objectives for the state. The Irish Constitution itself influenced by the Spanish Constitution, which contained provisions related to achieving social and economic justice. Thus, the directive principles reflect an evolution of constitutional thoughts seeking to reconcile democracy with social justice. In India, the directive principles were incorporated in Part 4 of the Indian Constitution, covering from Article 36 to Article 51. These provisions set out ideals and objectives that guide the state in lawmaking and policy formulation. Although they are non-justiciable, they possess significant constitutional importance. Article 37 explains the nature by stating that while directive principles are not enforceable by courts, they are fundamental in governance of the country. and it is the duty of state to apply them in making laws. The framers deliberately made them non-enforceable due to India's economic limitation at the time of independence, recognizing that immediate implementation was impractical. Instead, they were designed as the guiding principles to be realized progressively. The directive principle thus act as a guiding principle to be realized progressively. The directive principle thus act as a bridge between the preamble and the functioning of state, translating values such as justice, equality, fraternity into concrete welfare policies. Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar aptly described them as instructions to the legislative and executive, ensuring continuity of constitutional vision despite changing government. Now, to make the meaning clearer, we'll see the classification of directive principles and explore the articles covered into each category. The directive principles are broadly categorized in three categories based on their underlying philosophy. The first one is directives based on socialistic principle. The directive based on socialistic principle aimed at establishing economic and social justice by reducing inequalities and preventing exploitation. These principles reflects the constitutional commitment to create a society where wealth and resources are distributed in the manner that they serve the common good. They seek to protect the interest of workers, weaker section, ensure fair wages, promote public health, and provide social security to the vulnerable section. Article 38 directs the state to promote the welfare of people by securing social order based on social, economic, and political justice. It also mandates the state to minimize inequalities in income, state, facilities, and opportunity among the individuals and group. Article 39 further elaborates the economic objective of the state. It requires the state to direct the policies towards securing the right to an adequate means of livelihood for all the citizens, distribution of material resources in the manner that they serve common good, prevention of concentration of wealth and means of production in few hands, equal pay for equal work for both men and women, protection of health and strength of workers, protection of children and youth against exploitation. Article 41 provides for the right to work, education and public assistance in case of unemployment, old age, sickness and disability, subject to economic capacity of each state. Article 42 directs the state to ensure just and human condition of work and to promote and to provide maternity relief, thereby recognizing the special needs of working women. Article 42 directs the state to ensure just and human conditions of work and to provide maternity relief. Article 43 requires the state to secure a living wage, decent condition of work, and a standard of life that ensures full enjoyment of leisure and cultural opportunity for the workers. Article 43A provides for the participation of workers in the management of industry, reflecting the industrial democracy. Article 47 imposes a duty on a state to raise the level of nutrition, improve the standard of living, and enhance the public health, recognizing the health as a core component of welfare. Now, the second classification is the directive based on Gandhian principles. The Gandhian principles are inspired by the philosophy of the ideals of Mahatma Gandhi, who envisioned the India based on the self-sufficient villages, decentralization of power, moral values, and social harmony. These principles emphasize rural development, upliftment of weaker sections, promotion of cottage industry, and the prohibition of activities that are harmful to society. Article 40 directs the state to organize village panchayat and endow them with the powers to function as a unit of self-government, thereby strengthening grassroots democracy. Article 43 encourages the promotion of cottage industry on an individual or cooperative basis in rural areas, aiming to generate employment and support in rural economy. Article 43B mandates the state to promote the voluntary formation, autonomous functioning, democratic control, and professional management of cooperative societies, reinforcing economic democracy. Article 46 requires the state to promote educational and economic interest of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other weaker sections, and to protect them from social injustice and exploitation. Article 47 calls upon for the state to improve public health and prohibit consumption of intoxicated substance, drinks, drugs, and injurious to health, reflecting Gandhians' emphasis on moral and social well-being. Article 48 directs the state to prohibit the slaughter of cows, calves, and other milch and draught cattle and to improve their breeds, reflecting Gandhians' idea of compassion and rural economy. Further, the third classification is the directive based on liberal intellectual principles. The liberal intellectual principles reflect the modern democratic ideas such as rule of law, secularism, environmental protection, education, and international peace. These principles aim to build a governance state guided by the rational governance and global cooperation. Article 44 directs the state to secure a uniform civil code for citizens throughout the India with the objective of promoting national integration and gender justice. Article 45 mandates the provision of early childhood care and education for all the children below the age of 6 years, emphasizing the importance of foundational education. Article 48 calls for the organization of agriculture and animal husbandry on the modern and scientific lines, improving the productivity and sustainability. Article 48A imposes a duty on state to protect and improve the environment and to safeguard the forest and wildlife. Article 49 requires the state to promote monuments, places of artistic and historical importance, preserving the cultural heritage. Article 50 directs the separation of judiciary from the legislature and executive, ensuring the independence of judiciary. Article 51 lays down principles governing international relations, directing the state to maintain just and honorable relations with other nations, foster the respect of international law and treaties obligation, encourage the settlement of international dispute by arbitration. Now we'll see the relationship between fundamental rights and directive principle of state policy. One of the most debated issue in Indian constitutional law is the relationship between fundamental rights and DPSPs. Initially, the judiciary viewed fundamental right superior, but in the case of State of Madras versus Champakam Dorairajan, the Supreme Court held that the directive principle must give way to fundamental rights. However, this rigid approach gradually evolved. In Keswananda Bharti versus State of Kerala, the Supreme Court held that both fundamental rights and directive principles together form a part of basic structure of Indian Constitution. This judgment marked a turning point by recognizing that social justice cannot be sacrificed at the altar of individual liberty. In Manera Mills versus Union of India, the court emphasized that harmony between Part 3 and Part 4 is essential. The court observed that destroying either would damage the constitutional balance. Now we'll see the role of directive principle in judicial interpretation. Although the directive principles are non-justiciable, the judiciary has constantly used them to interpret the fundamental rights expansively. In Olga Tellis versus Bombay Municipal Corporation, the Supreme Court recognizes the right to livelihood as an integral part of right to life under Article 21, drawing inspiration from Article 39. Environmental protection under Article 21 has been influenced by Article 48A. Free legal aid has been recognized based on the Article 39A. Thus, directive principle act as a silent force in shaping constitutional interpretation. Now, we'll see some implementation through the welfare legislature. Although the directive principle of state policy are often criticized for being non-justiciable and vague, more than 6 decades of constitutional practice clearly showed that successive governments in India have actively implemented them through welfare legislation and policy measures. To give effect to Article 39, the state enacted land reforms laws abolishing zamindari system, imposing ceiling on land holdings, and distributing surplus land to landless laborers. Measures such as Minimum Wages Act and progressive taxation laws include income tax policies were introduced to reduce economic inequalities and protect weaker sections of the society. The 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act 1992 fulfilled the mandate of Article 40 by establishing 3-tier Panchayat Raj system at village, block and district level, thereby strengthening grassroots democracy. To promote the cottage industry under Article 43, the government set up institutions such as Village Industry Board, All India Handicraft Board, Silk Board and Core Board, providing financial and marketing support. In the field of education, Article 45 was realized through 86th Constitutional Amendment, followed by the Right of Children to Free and Compulsory Education Act 2009, which made free and compulsory education a fundamental right for children between the age of 6 to 14 years. To raise the standard of living, especially in rural areas, the government introduced programs such as Community Development Program, the National Integrated Rural Development Program, and the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act 2005, implemented in 2006 in accordance with Article 47. Welfare initiatives like maternity benefit and the midday meal schemes further supports women and children. Additionally, health and welfare schemes such as National Rural Health Mission, and the Pradhan Mantri Gram Swasthya Yojana reflects the social sector responsibility of the Indian state. Overall, the directive principle have constantly guided legislative and policy decisions. While the substantial progress has been made, gaps in health and education still persist, requiring continued governmental efforts to fully realize the constitutional vision of a democratic welfare state. Now, every coin has its two sides. Thus, the directive principle also faces some criticism. Despite their importance, the directive principle of state policy has faced criticism mainly due to their non-justiciable nature. As court cannot compel their enforcement, their implementation therefore largely depends on political will of the government. Economic limitation, shifting priorities, and in recent times, the impact of globalization and privatization have further slowed down the diluted welfare-oriented policy. However, these challenges do not reduce the constitutional value of DPSPs. The constitution makers intentionally made them flexible, recognizing that social and economic conditions evolve over time. The flexibility allows the state to frame welfare policies according to national needs and available resources. Though progressive legislation and judicial interpretation, the directive principles have continued to guide governance and public policy. Lastly, the directive principle of state policy forms a moral foundation of our Indian constitution. While fundamental rights safeguards the individual freedom, the directive principle imposes a duty on the state to promote social and economic welfare. Together, Part 3 and Part 4 creates a balance between constitutional framework. In the nation still confronting with the inequality and poverty, the relevance of directive principle is undiminished. The true measure of India as a welfare state, it does not found in the constitutional framework alone, but the state's commitment to transform these ideas into the lives of reality of people. Thank you.
Tashu, thank you very much. It was a nice detailed explanation of the directive principles of state policy. You had referred to the various articles which are involved in that. So, a small token from Hammurabi to you.
Thank you, sir.